For those of you in the room who do not know us, Gender at Work India is a non-profit and an affiliate of Gender at Work Global, which is an international network of gender experts and practitioners who work towards building cultures of equity and inclusion with key focus on women's empowerment and gender equality. We work on organizational change and gender equality at the individual level, at the organizational level, and at the systemic level. Since 2003, our associates have supported more than 100 organizations, ranging from trade unions, small women's organizations, to large multilateral organizations, private public sector foundations, to develop and assess plans, strategies, and programs to improve results for gender equality and women's rights. I want to start this discussion by highlighting a few fast facts about the status of women in the Indian workplace. Women form less than 1/3 of the total workforce in India. This despite women candidates often proving to be more employable. In India, there has been a persistent fall in the female-male labor participation rate from around 45% in 2004 to less than 34% in 2015. In 2015, women occupied only 15% of business leadership positions in India and only 7% of board seats, making it the third lowest nation in having women in leadership roles. 59% of men make more money than women in similar positions, according to a 2013 Randstad report. These above stats provide just a brief glimpse of the pervasive and institutionalized gender bias prevalent in the Indian workforce, which is manifest in the discriminatory policies and practices, and which prevents women from equal opportunities for growth and advancement in their careers. Be it low compensation, pay or benefits, be it poor, unsafe working conditions, be it the rising issue of gender-based violence and harassment at the workplace, be it the lack of gender-sensitized environments and workplace designs. Working women in India are increasingly facing a backlash when it comes to an assertion of their rights at the workplace. The Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act 2013, many of you in the room might be aware of that. While it did mark a defining moment on this discourse, the lack of clear implementation guidelines, the lack of accountability mechanisms have really negated the impact it ought to have had. This dialogue is a very modest attempt to identify those challenges, identify the barriers and the bias. And when we talk of bias, we're talking of not just explicit bias, but also of the implicit, the unconscious bias, which the panel will speak to, which is faced by women in the workplace. And at the same time, we're going to try come up with some innovative, collaborative, and sustainable strategies and some best practices to bridge this gap and promote gender equity and inclusion in the workplace. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Amita Desai, Hamburg Ambassador to India and Founder Director of Goethe Zentrum Hyderabad. Welcome, Amita, and thanks. Amita Desai has lived, studied, and worked in several countries in the world, exposed to an eminently international experience due to her father's diplomatic status, and as such has grown up in an environment rich in learning, languages, and multiculturalism. She has worked at the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce in Bombay, followed by about 10 years at the Goethe Institute, the Max Muller Bhavan, Bombay, till 2001, when she moved back to Hyderabad. In Hyderabad, after 3 years of honorary service as the vice principal of the Vidyaranya High School for Boys and Girls, she was invited to start a German cultural center. She is the founder director of the Goethe Zentrum Hyderabad, established in December 2004. She was festival director of the Hyderabad Literary Festival 2012 and has also represented the DFG, German Research Foundation in Hyderabad between 2006 to 15. Amita has initiated, nurtured, and supported many cultural events in the city, including the Hyderabad Western Music Foundation, the Doku Circle of Hyderabad, Women's March, Emerging Palette in the Visual Arts, Hyderabad Literary Festival, and Hyderabad Jazz Festival, amongst others. Amita, stage is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to be here at this crucial session on bridging the gap at the workspace, hosted by the Gender at Art India. I thank the organizers for inviting me today to give me the opportunity to collect my thoughts, to rein in my emotions, and to look at the tasks ahead. I look forward to the panel discussion, to learning from experiences, and most importantly, becoming a part of the collective that must, and there is not an iota of doubt, urgently and immediately to counter discriminatory policies and practices. We may well be at the cusp of a revolution, led by traumatized, victimized individuals who've taken the lead to start #MeTooIndia, to voice their experiences and call out perpetrators of violence. I believe this is the beginning, and indeed it is the tip of the iceberg that is exposing the not so unknown realities of gender violence, unequal salary packages, lesser opportunities, as you said, unsafe working environments, gender insensitive work conditions, and lack of basic facilities at workspaces. All of these are clearly violating the fundamental rights of women in the workforce. It took Nirbhay in December 2012 to give us our voice. A collective voice that brought women with children or grandmothers leading their granddaughters by hand to attend the candlelight vigil. The individual pain and possible trauma every woman in this country experiences at some stage of her life became a collective voice that was heard all across the globe. And while POSH, the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act, was enforced or put into force, into act in December 2013, we have yet to see it fully implemented, particularly now, when women are really coming out to speak of transgressions in their workspaces. How can then we assure that women are able to occupy personal and professional spaces of their choice, to grow, to follow their dreams, to become voices that do matter, to be able to live in an environment free of fear and biased power equations that need to be negotiated every single day. And yes, perhaps even be at peace and be happy. Yesterday, as I was readying myself for work, I heard a cheerful chatter in my kitchen. My house managers, the maid, attendants, a nurse looking after my aging parents, and my needs. When I became acutely aware that I was at home, while these young women actually were in their workspace. How is it that I, and in this case clearly the entitled person, ensure the safety of my staff, allow them space to grow, joy, work satisfaction, and fearless working environment? The chatter at tea time in the kitchen was clearly a joyful coming together. But this, however, we are completely aware of, is not always the case. Our dialogue hence must be inclusive, sensitive to women in different work environments, ranging from corridors of power to caste and stigma-ridden street corner of my Bhaji Valley. How can we participate in creating cultures that promote equality alongside necessarily inclusivity? The present movement, which has shaken the entertainment industry, media houses, cultural spaces, dancers, musicians, temples, churches, academia, is probably going to set the tone for what could follow. At this moment, we have voices who, with great courage and immense personal and professional risk, have spoken out. Interestingly, we still have the men who should be burying their heads somewhere, have slammed cases of defamation against the very women who they have aggressed upon. They feel and are still entitled, fearless, and running loose in our society. We are yet to see the kind of jail bharao movement where the courts across the country should be inundated with cases filed by women under various legal handles available today. Let the judiciary, policymakers, law enforcers deal with the epidemic that this problem actually is. In fact, this is an issue that we must all address. We must all acknowledge that sexual harassment at workplace, in our society, within our homes, is violence, abuse of power, and a criminal offense. Niharika Singh, in the letter that she wrote recently to Sandhya Menon, calling out Nawazuddin Siddiqui, spells it out beautifully, and I quote her. She says she's writing this piece to expand my own understanding of what constitutes abuse, who we choose to punish, and whom we are allowing to forgive or willing to forgive. I recall an incident many, many years ago. One of my male staff member had an issue with a female colleague who would regularly exchange pleasantries with other fellow workers in the building, women and men. She was a good worker, young, I thought beautiful and charming. She became well known in the building, and this somehow seemed to have bothered the devoted, dedicated male colleague who didn't think smiling befits a young widowed woman. There was serious friction, and often situations came to an impasse. We were still a small office of 4 or 5 people, and hence I frequently needed to make peace. When I understood that this is patriarchy playing out towards the young, vulnerable female colleague, I needed to take a stand. I recall that at that tete-a-tete, when I made it clear that if 2 equal parties must part ways, the woman would be given the first right of refusal. This caused pain, great disbelief, but gradually accepted, or at least not resisted. I'm happy to say that both these wonderful people continue to work with us and are with us in the Institute. I'm also able to add that today the office has the strength of about 29 people. 17 of them are women and 12 male colleagues. This is in tune with, and I represent the German Cultural Center here, in tune with a policy that was taken in Germany many decades ago, about 25 years ago, where it was mandated that you put down the percentage of men and women in your organization. And it had to be at least 50%. Of course, at the beginning, it was more the support staff that filled up the positions, but gradually that gave way to really equalizing the percentages. And today we can say that this is a norm. Our society has normalized violence, even glorified it in many ways. We believe it is a higher form of living if we allow ourselves to be sacrificed like Ahalya, Sita, or Devaki, that it is our lot to accept wrongdoings, to allow transgressions throughout life, and allow rape of body, mind, and soul. Without question, of course, and no resistance. And when we bleed too much, go and sit in the corner like an outcast. In this context of generations of silence, fear of backlash, in the deeply patriarchal India, Me Too comes as a fresh hope, an opportunity, evoking pent-up angst and pain. Some hard questions indeed must be raised. Patriarchy in all its forms challenged, and gender, class, caste bias eradicated. If these simmerings and eruptions can be channelized to build an environment of gender parity and inclusion, we may as a society be able to turn around the present crisis into an opportunity. The seminar today is crucial in that hope can be reignited, collective strength realigned, and public discourse revisited to do what your mission statement, the Gender at Work mission statement, so succinctly puts forth. And I'm going to quote it and read it out because I think it is absolutely pertinent and crucial to what should follow henceforth, and not just in the panel, but otherwise. Gender and Work at Work is committed to changing these deep-seated power structures of discrimination and social norms by supporting individuals and groups in systems, organizations, and communities to promote social justice and gender equality. We are committed to connecting these agents of change to collaborate for greater collective action and impact. Your session could not be better contextualized than in the current movement. I thank you and wish your work greater success. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'd just like to inform you that one of our panelists, Shobha Dikshit, was unable to make it owing to an urgent business commitment, but we have all our wonderful panelists right here. Our first panelist is Tanuja Aburi, founder and CEO of Beyond Pings, a boutique consulting firm specializing in diversity strategy, which is working towards reducing the gender gap at a country, corporate, and individual level. Tanuja has over 20 years of experience in human resources in various leadership positions with reputed organizations like NTT Data, Bank of America, GE, and D.E. Shaw in India and across the US. Another key passion for Tanuja is working on building employability skills for women at the grassroots level. Tanuja is also part of the CII Women's Wing, which is the Indian Women's Network, and she's working closely with them towards creating and building a diverse workforce. Please welcome Tanuja. Our second panelist is Vijay Padmanabhan, Director and Head of Global SEC at Invesco. Since joining Invesco 3 years ago, Vijay has been instrumental in building and developing the global shared services for finance in Hyderabad, offering the entire spectrum of finance operations. Vijay also chairs the CSR committee, the Finance IWN, which is the Invesco Women's Network Committee, besides leading other key culture initiatives within the organization. Vijay comes back with over 18 years of experience in the domain of finance transformation, ERP consulting, banking, and treasury operations. Please give a hand to Vijay. Our third panelist she's not local, she's come all the way from Chennai, and that's Vaishnavi Sundar, an independent filmmaker, speaker, writer, and activist from Chennai who has worked in theatre and films for the past 7 years in various capacities. Vaishnavi is also better known as the founder of Women Making Films, a global community aimed to help female filmmakers worldwide connect, collaborate, and create works in the audiovisual medium. Vaishnavi writes, directs, and produces the films under the banner of Lime Soda Films and has just completed India's first feature film documentary on workplace sexual harassment titled But What Was She Wearing? We really look forward to that film, Vaishnavi. Welcome on board. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Ujitra Punaiya, Assistant Professor in the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, in the School of Gender Studies, where she teaches undergrad and postgrad courses in sociology, development and labor using a gender lens. In fact, just earlier this year, Ujitra defended her PhD thesis in sociology titled Marriage Desire and the Reproduction of Caste, a study of Agarwal Banyas of Delhi from JNU. Prior to this, Ujitra has worked with national and international research organizations on diverse development issues such as food and nutritional security of tribal groups, agrarian land relations in parts of North India, Dalit political leadership, and the historical construction of marginalized categories in cornerstone United Nations documents. Please welcome Ujitra. The panel is moderated by Sudarshana Kundu, Interim Executive Director for Gender at Work Global and Country Director for Gender at Work India, where she is working with a range of organizations to drive institutional change for advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. Through her work leading UN Women's programs on gender and governance, Sudarshana has worked with governments and CSOs across the globe, providing recommendations on enhancing service delivery for women. She has advised numerous organizations on developing strategies that ensure public and private sector actors have a stronger social and economic impact, particularly with respect to gender equality. In the past, Sudarshana has also worked with the Fortune 500 company, where she pioneered several new organizational development initiatives. Over to you, Sudarshana.
Thank you so much. Thanks. We have a lovely set of panelists today, so without further ado, we dive right in. And Amita, thank you so much for that context setting. Really appreciate that. You really brought it together. And taking on from what Amita said, she's already talked of evidence of human rights violation, evidence of the fact that women are kind of facing abuses in the workplace. On the other side, there is also evidence that having women in the workplace, having women in labor force, actually leads to better social outcomes, right? Or better corporate outcomes for that matter. Whatever that evidence might be. If that's the case, and I would like to start with you, Ujitra, just to give us a slightly broader, from the academic context, what are you seeing as some of these challenges? Why are organizations or systems not taking or not bringing on women in the workplace?
So let me begin with what is immediate to us, which is the social. And I'll try and answer this question in two ways, by focusing on the social as well as the sectoral. So the social encompasses the family, the community, and the sectoral I'll focus on the market. Now when we think about a country like India, where women's participation in the labor force is abysmal, and you heard Iram tell us the data when she began, and so did ma'am, we begin to wonder, why does it look so abysmally low? It's not that when you look around, women are not in schools and higher education. So that journey of getting women to education institutions has happened. And sociologists in the 1970s were saying these educational institutes work as waiting halls for women to get married. We need to ask ourselves as 2018 if that has really changed. Because definitely you have more women in higher education, but that move from higher education to employment is not happening. Why is that not happening? One reason and that's fundamental, is the institution of family, which continues to be extremely lovingly patriarchal. Right? When we think about the family, and I studied an extremely affluent business class group in Delhi, and these are the higher end, right? You're looking at the elite, and that's the curious case with India, because you would have at the higher end women who are extremely educated but still not in the labor force. So what are these women then doing? What they're doing is they're staying back at home and undertaking what is called social reproductive roles. These are extremely important roles for the family and the community to prosper. So going to a religious gathering, going to a kitty party, going to somebody's mundan, all of this is labor, right? This is not entertainment, it's really tedious to do this. And it's very important for the family and the community to move ahead because of the labor that the woman puts in. So all the Diwali sweets that come home, who does the labor behind it? The woman in the household, especially in a business family, right? So in these families, in the younger generation, because there's so much angst which is built in, with women studying from ISB and still have to sit at home, women go on to open their own boutiques on the side. This is the great market for entrepreneurship, right? So there are a lot of bakeries coming up. They become fashion designers, there are makeup artists, there are people who are clicking pictures at movies. Ask the background of these women and you'll be surprised they're not necessarily coming from your middle and lower middle class. Many of them are also coming from your affluent backgrounds. So the family plays a fundamental role. So the reason for women not participating in the labor force in the upper could be because of family in this way. Women in the lower, you would see in lower middle class neighborhoods, women would be taking tuitions, or they would be tailoring, or they would have somebody come home and they would teach them some kind of baking. Why does the home become such an important site of labor? It's because that is all that is permissible. The honor of the family and the man would go away and they would feel emasculated if a woman coming from an affluent caste especially was going out in the labor market and participating in specific ways. So labor does happen, and some of it is also paid, but it's always in these piecemeal ways. That's the social part of it. The sectoral part, unfortunately, many times the market also takes forward all the biases that the family and the community has. Which means if you go to the manufacturing, you will have women using their nimble fingers, and this is what the word that's used in the market, instead of operating heavy machinery. The nimble fingers immediately becomes unskilled work, the machinery becomes skilled work and highly paid. So this familial bias, the gendered bias, also comes back to the sectoral, which is the market. There are also issues when it comes to hiring, which we will speak about at length, the wages of women, the wage gaps between men and women at workspace, women's mobility once they enter and how they go forward in the labor market. And for a bulk of the women who are in your middle and lower middle class where employment is definitely desirable, the question is the labor market giving them quality employment? When I say quality employment, I mean an employment which also involves them getting a decent wage as well as benefits. Right? So the social security cover, which is absolutely important, your education, your health, your maternity, these are your fundamental rights, and that makes quality employment.
The context in the factors of family and all of that, where are you seeing from the organization's perspective or the range of organizations that you're working with, what are the challenges that maybe they're facing in terms of bringing on women in the workforce, or why are they kind of not actually taking that on?
Sure. So before I go forward, I have two observations to make here.
Sure.
So this room is equally diversified. I see that. So there's equal number of men sitting here. So can we clap for the men who are sitting here and participating? That's fantastic. Usually conversations like this are for the woman, by the woman. So very pleasant change. Thank you for coming over. That's a very good beginning. And second is we have made sure we have 20% of diversity on the team. So can we clap for the only male in the panelist here? We do value your inputs. Okay, so thank you for that. So what Ucharita has spoken about is what's happening at the top and what's happening at the bottom of the pyramid. And I'm going to take a bite at what's happening with the middle class, really, right? So a service class background girl going through college education and getting into a job. So there are two parts which are basically important to look at.
One, I would talk from a corporate side and then from the girl side. One is, of course, the companies are making a whole lot of these efforts to bring in more women. It's staying at a lip service. It's not really going down. Two reasons for that. A lot of companies don't know how to. The intent is there, but they're not able to really go through the grind of making it happen. For example, a woman, if she's going through a maternity leave for 6 months, that position is open for 6 months. We don't even know if the woman is coming back or not. That's a very realistic challenge a project manager would have on hand, right? So his intent could be very nice that I want 20%, 40% women in my team, but when he's dealing with these transactional issues on a day-to-day basis, he says, help me figure out this because I have some numbers to be delivered. I have to deliver this project on time. It doesn't matter for me, it's a man or a woman. So he's not really looking at from a gender lens, he's looking at it from some things to be delivered. So intent is great, but when it comes to execution, a lot of organizations are struggling because they don't know how to. That's one part. The second part is, I see part of the problem where, and some people might hate me, but I will still go take a dig on it, is we are our problems ourselves, okay? A lot of women go through this grind of the 30 years career. There could be 3 times I will have a dip. Maybe the first dip when I'm getting married, the second dip for the first child, second child. But my bigger agenda, that I have a 30-year career, I have to keep going up and make it happen. Some women do it seamlessly, some figure it out, some don't. But when it might sound stereotypical, but if you have 10 men talking together, they'll say, oh, she's not going to come back after maternity, or she's at that manageable age. Part of it is what stories are we telling at workplaces. If it's a larger story saying 80% of women not going to come back after maternity break, that's what is the message men carry, and then say, can I trust this woman, is she going to come back or not? So part of the problem I see is we created. I don't know the solution, but that's one part of the problem which we need to, as women, see how do we build our ecosystem and solve this bigger problem. Part of it is to engage with organizations and help this transition and say, hey, I understand your problem, we'll figure it out how we get to the solution.
And just quickly, because you also did this documentary recently, so you talked to so many women. What are you seeing as some of the trends, some of the challenges that these women are facing in the workplace?
I would wholeheartedly disagree that women are the problem. Women are not. Women should never be victimized for the way the society works and and the way a woman projects herself in relation to the society. I want to touch upon the point that you started off with. The point being that there is some kind of a calculable benefit of having women in the workforce. Now, if I were to talk about the industry that I belong to, independent filmmaking, I do see a surge in the number of women that are making films, not just the directors, but all the other different departments, which is wonderful. I see that there is a change in the way women make films as well. Now, obviously, there is going to be a hashtag, not all men, not all women. I'm not going to touch upon the not all part of it, but then the way women have been making films in the past few years, there's a psychological shift in the way men see themselves on screen, which has a lot of bearing on how they see themselves as individuals in their real life. Now, if you were to touch upon toxic masculinity or the bro code, the way a woman tackles a male character makes him vulnerable, makes him challenge the man box that the society is expecting him to be part of, is really amazing. Because when men watch a film, like there is a hero who's thrashing 100 other people, and in the end he chases this woman who says no to him till the end of the movie, and the male director would have written eventually that the girl would say yes to him, so they live, marry happily ever after. But there is a psychological change in the way when women make films. Men, how do they see themselves as? is it's turning out to be like a huge event for them. Wow, there is this hero and he cries. That must be so freeing. I must try that. You know, a man who can have some kind of a relationship with his own vulnerability changes the way in which he lives in his own life, his own personal life, be it at workplace or be it at home. So I see this as a great way of augmenting that data, which I'm not very familiar with, and the number doesn't matter, but it is true. Qualitatively, it is very true. And about this film and the number of women I have interviewed for this film, I would have spoken to about 100, 150 people easily, across class, across caste, across religion, across industries. I have spoken to a lot of women. Most of them didn't want to be part of the project because I wasn't going to have anybody anonymous, because nothing wrong with being anonymous. I just wanted to, you know, make a film where I have women speaking non-anonymously and wanted to see what the people's excuse is right now. You know, you keep saying women don't come forward. Now I have women coming forward. What's your excuse now? So that's the choice I made. But the women who chose to be anonymous, the kind of information that they tell you, it is not about harassment at all actually. Even my film doesn't delve right into sexual harassment because that doesn't happen in isolation. We're talking about a systemic issue, starting from patriarchy, as ma'am said. When a woman chooses to come to work, that is not an easy choice. Right there, my industry, for example, there is all kinds of taboo associated with this industry. It's you know, if you go there, you'll be exploited sexually, you'll be coerced into doing sexual favors for you to go up. Which industry doesn't have that, right? But then there is this added this thing about popular culture, popular media, and everything. So if we, when I actually bring it down to, like, if I were to make 5 points that were too striking when I was speaking to all these women, I realized the issue is not sexual harassment. The issue is that women are not seeing themselves enough outside. The reason why women are not seeing themselves enough outside is because you're not given enough opportunities, first of all, to do a job or to take up education, depending on the class you belong to. What happens is, when you start seeing yourself outside more openly, you're not looked at as this lone figure that, you know, men could subject you in coerce you into some kind of harassment, abuse, or anything like that. What women feel is, just let us be, just leave us alone. I mean, sexual harassment is one thing, but let us come to your workforce. You know, that's basically the biggest gripe they all have. If you were to take construction workers, for example, they're belonging to not your elite caste, elite class. They belong to the lowest of the caste, and sometimes for them it's a matter of pleasing the supervisor in order to get that particular day's labor. Now, when she is talking about sexual harassment under 2013 legislation, she can't even grapple with the idea of it, because before sexual harassment even begins, there are all kinds of other things that she has to deal with before she even addresses that issue. So I think it's great that we're sitting and discussing this. I think the problem lies in a far more grassroots level where, you know, something needs to be disrupted. It's not enough that, you know, this film, it's a shame that this film is made. You know, it's like a smoking disclaimer that a film has. Everybody knows smoking cigarette will kill you, but you still have to do it. You still have to put that disclaimer. And just like how, you know, in sexual harassment, you know sexual harassment is wrong, and yet you're asked to have an internal complaints committee that is made mandatory and things like that. You know, sometimes it baffles me. It's a big paradox. But then I do believe that there is a whole lot of good if we have women in workplace, more women in a workplace, where they kind of act as some kind of a support system to themselves. And it's somehow better, is what I think.
Where do you think India is with respect to that a little bit, or your sector is in terms of finance? What is maybe the challenges within your sector that you're seeing in terms of addressing some of this?
First, I want to point out there is a statistic available which says that companies with a very diverse group of people, that's Boston BCG's report, they have the best, the top line, bottom line, the productivity, efficiency, innovation is the highest in the most diverse companies. Having said that, is there a problem in corporate? Answer is yes. The problems are like basically 3 or 4 types, right? One, a lot of corporates do a great job of lip service. I mean, they've got these great interventions which are focused on diversity, but they don't really do anything about it. So implementation is a big challenge. Second is the way men perceive, there's a huge perception difference between the men and women on these interventions, right? Men think that, oh, just by me participating and talking about it, I made the change. Oh, you know what, I'm part of this great initiative. Whereas, and you know, I've been partly at fault as well. I've learned a lot of lessons during the course of my career, and I can talk about it over the course. And you know, sometimes there's no realization of the fact that, you know, there is a fundamental problem. You just think it is a metric, it's a checklist, let me just get done with it and move on with my bottom line and top line, right? And that's a mindset that needs to change. So I think, I mean, having a lot of interventions now, a lot of corporates, what they do is they come up with 10, 20 different interventions. One for you know, women at marriageable age, women at entry level, women at mid-career, women at advanced career. The whole advancement, there are 10 programs associated with it, and they don't really walk the talk. I mean, so that's another fundamental problem is, I mean, there are too many programs, too diluted, limited focus. So, and I'm part of the internal complaints committee, so I want to bring up another fact. I don't know if you've seen the recent article. There are corporates with a lot of ICC harassment cases reported, and we do have some. And I was talking to some of my peer group friends saying, hey, how does the statistics look like? Hey, I have none in my organization. I think that's the biggest problem. And the very fact that it doesn't have an open culture reflects on that organization, saying that, you know, people are not comfortable talking about it. So in a nutshell, that's what I would like to summarize it as.
The fact that reporting doesn't happen, I mean, one of the things that HR and senior leadership have to learn is that reporting is good. It is actually a sign of transparency and trust in the organization, so encouraging that. And one of the things that we're doing as General Network, just kind of, we've started a survey on sexual harassment in the media industry to start off with that, just to kind of get some of this data and out in the open to see what's really happening in terms of compliance. And we just want to do more of that with other sectors as well, right? Just get some of this information which is there and say, hey, yes, there's so many sexual ICC committees, but you know, that's not, there's no reporting happening. Why is that kind of thing? Right? But
sorry, can I just answer one more on the industry you asked
right,
about?
yeah.
So I'm part of the asset management industry. 5 years ago, the top 10 list in India of fund managers, there were no women, right? It was a very male-dominated industry. Now we have 3 women in that space. So that's speaking volumes. Is that the end most of the top financial houses in India are headed by women, right? So that percentage is changing. It's for the good. The second number that I want to share from an asset management industry perspective is McKinsey came out with a report recently where it says that an entry point in the financial services industry, it's a 50-50 ratio. When it goes all the way to the C-suite, it's 80-20. Right, 80 being men. So I think that speaks volumes of the problem that we have in the industry.
Yeah, it's that leaky middle. So you know, then you know, coming back to you in terms of, you know, if you speak from your own experience in the asset management sector or your previous experience at Deloitte or where you are. What are some of the initiatives that you're seeing which are, and you talked of the fact that there are fragmented programs which don't really work. So what is actually working in terms of getting women onboarded and keeping them in the workplace?
See, I think first thing is for a man to qualify to even talk about diversity, he should take a good look at the mirror, right? Does he practice diversity at home? How much do you support your spouse and in doing household stuff, or I've made a lot of mistakes. I'm not saying I'm perfect, right? I mean, let's talk about my career journey. I've hopped a lot of jobs. So when I moved my first job, I was not married at that point. I went and asked my dad, can I move this job? I'm getting a great opportunity with GE. I'm getting this pay. And he said, take it. I got another job. I switched. I went home, asked my dad. He said, do it. Then I got married. I changed another job. I went and asked my wife, you know, I've got this great career opportunity and I'm going to progress into this path, and the vision that I have for myself, this aligns to that. And she said, yeah, let's go take it. It was a movement to another city, and she said, let's do it and I'll find a job for myself. Another job change topic came, and that's when it really hit me that it's always been about me, right? My career, me, the guy in the family. I mean, a part of the reason is I come from a family where my mom was a housewife, so my dad was taking the decision. He just kept hopping places because banking industry, you had to do that. And it was at that point when me and my wife had this conversation, we realized, and that's when it hit me that it's always been about me, right? I mean, I've never thought from her perspective. So I had to change my way of thinking. The amount of struggle my wife had to go through in a corporate life, she comes and talks about it, and that's when I realized, my God, I mean, this is absolute crap. I mean, she leaves home on time just to be with family, and she gets branded as she's not ambitious at all, right? She works from home now, and every on-site opportunity, the first ask goes to the guy because he's in office, you're working from home, when she is much more productive than most of the people working in corporates. So this is when I felt very strongly about this, and I felt as a man I have to champion this cause. If I have to make the difference, I need to lead by example. And one thing which I've done, which worked really well, is mentoring program. I think a very structured mentoring program, especially for women, especially with this moment of truth, people who are going through those various phases. If you can mentor them and tell them it's absolutely fine to do all of that, but you know, you need to have a vision and a goal. And I think mentoring program is something that's worked really well. In fact, we have a lot of interventions, but as I said, one of the things as a leadership, we've gone back to the drawing board and said, let's just keep it to one or two simple things and make the most of impact. From a hiring standpoint, right? I mean, I can go on and on, so please cut me. From a hiring standpoint, I think one of the, like I was talking about, she mentioned about someone going on maternity leave. So we were hiring, and we've got this position in finance. My leader, he came to me and said, oh, you know what, Vijay, she just got married. I think we should defer this decision. I said, why? Because she said, you know, she's going to go on maternity leave and all this stuff soon. Because she'd been married for 6 months, and so that mindset had to change. And so from a hiring standpoint, what we do is we create a diverse panel. We want to make sure that if it's not a diverse panel, all these problems are going to keep happening. So we created a diverse panel, and that brought about a sea change in the way the kind of questions that get asked, have been happening. Another thing that we've been doing is a very focused hiring. For example, not because there is, so we go to campuses. The last 3 years, 90% of my campus hires are women. Not because of my goal or the metric that I've been assigned to, but purely because we've got exceptional talent available at that level. So getting them early on, but grooming them and mentoring them through the process. And I strongly believe that there's got to be some sponsorship from men as well at the top levels to say, I really believe in this cause and I'll walk the talk.
Absolutely agree with the mentoring piece, and it is one-on-one. You need to really, it's a drop by drop that difference you make, and a little nudging, and just, I can give you personal examples where I'm just doing a 1 hour conversation with a woman and saying, how are you looking, the vision part, I will have 20 obstacles, and it's not that men don't have obstacles, right? So how do I pan my 30 years of career? If that conversation, if you're able to do at different points, every time she's kind of going down, that really helps women to stay put. So a lot of organizations are actually doing this besides mentoring. During the 6 months period when she's on leave, they attach a buddy to her so that she kind of stays connected. She's not feeling left out, and she's also not feeling that I'm not wanted when I come back, I just feel like a vegetable sitting at home, etc. So they kind of keep her pepped up, and psychologically, emotionally, physically, everything is on check. So the chances of women coming back because somebody is holding hand. So that's absolutely important. The second, the reasons why companies fail and why they are not able to make a difference is if you do not have a leadership buy-in, it kind of becomes a lip service. Yeah, and it's not just because of some fancy la-di-da programs, it's about really believing. If you're believing in it, automatically translates into action. And it's not about matrix anymore. It's basically a cause that you're able to see. So the companies who are not able to make the difference I've seen are the ones who are kind of doing it for tick mark's sake. I've had conversation where I'm called in the night by my friend and he's saying, can you come for an early morning discussion? My CEO wants to meet you. And I'm like, what is it about? Okay, so you're working in diversity, come, it's an urgent meeting. And the meeting is about, they had some 5 white guys who flew in from the US and they see this boardroom full of men and they don't see any woman. So that guy's got a meeting and he's saying, why no woman? And he wants to fix it tomorrow. I'm like, okay, let's just go shopping. There are vegetables available. There are vegetables. Let's just get them. It doesn't work like that, right? So it took a lot for me to tell him that it's not about looking pretty faces sitting in a boardroom like in your drawing room. It's more than that. So in that organization, now I've signed up a 1-year engagement, which is not a lip service. I said, the moment it's a lip service, I'm not needed. You just can do it yourselves. So the conversation with the leader is about, is it going to make an impact? And he can't see the impact today. And the biggest challenge for me to show him the impact. I could be working as a consultant with him and I can say, okay, so end of the year you will have 5 women moving to leadership position, so what? That's the question. I'm investing, say, 5 lakh rupees doing this program. If I invest the same money on men, I will have 4 men leaders cutting it for. So what is the difference? So the conversations all the time with the leadership is, show me the difference, show me the money. The ROI, which we talk about, you know, the reports which say women at board level doing better, etc. There is no right formula or a straight-jacketed answer saying 2 + 2 = 4. It isn't. All is the derived reports that we are talking about, and that's something which, it's a difficult conversation. It's not easy to convince leaders.
I've noticed how female CEOs have no shame in admitting that they want to only hire women. And what's there to be having any shame about that, right? There have been some male CEOs, co-founders of startups who I've interviewed for the film. In my film, about 32 people have spoken, 27 are women. So the man, one of them is a co-founder, he is profoundly invested in the fact that I want to make this right because it's going to benefit me. I want to make this right. I want to take care of this diversity not as a checklist but as a program that is going to help me. There is a self-interest in, you know, a common interest as well. So when he broached the topic that way, I realized some of the men who watched him say those things started looking at it very differently. So my film is divided, it's 110 minutes, my film is divided into 17 chapters. One of the chapter is that actually setting up all these things is good for you. To have a committee is good for you. To have conversations about harassment is good for you. To have women in an organization is good for you. So I try to sort of throw it in such a way that you don't look at it as, oh, some feminists are just raging, mad, man-hating, whatever, doing their thing, you know, it's come to that right now. But if you look at it from the way as if it would help you irrespective of what the gender of the CEO is, suddenly things started becoming a little gentle. Men weren't aggressive. Men were trying to understand more. Oh, did you say it's going to benefit me? Tell me how. You know, that's how it became soon after. But then, of course, this conversation remains only in your, you know, corporate organizations and the organized sector, so to speak. The unorganized sector is a whole different story altogether. I just wanted to touch upon the ICC part of it, where SEBI has put it down on their regulation that listed companies are supposed to have ICC in their organization, and the first warning they get, if they haven't set it up, the first they get a warning, they have to pay 50,000 rupees. The second time, their listing will be removed from the. So what organizations are starting to do is they are setting up a namesake ICC, and they are bringing in there must be an external member who is completely not got anything to do with the organization. They bring in somebody from an NGO they do CSR with. So obviously the CSR NGO is not going to indict the CEO if the CEO is the perpetrator in question. So then what they do is, at the end of their annual report, nobody knows where that goes on, nobody knows where that annual report goes, but they're supposed to make one. They just say, number of sexual harassment cases reported, 0. You know, how can it be possible where you haven't set up a community where women are aware that there is a complaints committee that you can go talk to, where it's okay to say that I have been harassed? If you haven't made all those things clear, how can you claim that you have no sexual harassment cases at all? So I've realized when I've talked to all these people, I've spoken to women from the NGO who have been those external members in the ICC. I have spoken to CEOs who have hired these women in their organization. I've spoken to trade union members. I've spoken to this garment factory workers union where very young children, as soon as they complete their schooling, they're sent away in hordes. Menial job, menial, no safety, and then there's the supervisor who's constantly harassing them, so on and so forth. All these organizations are also supposed to set up and have an annual report at the end. There is nothing. So this ICC is basically a futile exercise where corporate organizations, organized sectors are just doing it so that they can continue to be listed in SEBI. But the unorganized sector is always getting short-staffed in this because we can't have an ICC. Like, I'm a filmmaker, I work on the road, that's my workplace. Like domestic workers that you mentioned, ma'am, that's their workplace. How then would I go to an ICC where I don't have a hierarchy, where I don't have a boss? My boss is this lady whose house I go to. I've talked about disabled women. We talked about, Iram mentioned about the implicit biases, right? I've talked about women coming from northeastern cities, states, to the metros, where you look at them and you by default think that it's okay to harass them. Because that's what you do as people outside in roads, in the society. You by default put them in a certain box. I could also keep going on. I mean, I would, please stop me. But I think I'm alluding to the point where if there is a female leader who's definitely invested in trying to bring about a change, it's not just going to help the women that she is recruiting. They see her as a role model, and that's a fantastic place to be. But it is also helping her as a CEO in a capitalist world where she can actually make profits, in an organization that is happy, that is harassment ridden, and where you have a system in place, it's actually good for them. So when you touch upon that topic, somehow everyone's really interested.
So a little bit on the fact, and because the conversation has possibly veered towards numbers and numerics and gender parity, but gender equality is a much broader concept. And maybe if you could allude to some of those and what you're seeing as maybe some things which are promising in sort of looking at gender equality in the labor force. Just not numbers maybe, because that's what we get so caught up and mired about.
Just to add of what's being said so far, the ICC came about because of Vishakha judgment. We had the Companies Act come about, which said in 2013 one woman needs to be on the board of directors. And now SEBI has enforced it, and we're going to have two because they realize it's just the family members who are being on the board. So now there's going to be a family member plus a promoter, not from a promoter's background. Right? So here is where I want to speak a little bit about the role of the state, which becomes very important. Because otherwise it's going to be a narrative of good men, few good bad men. And few strong women, and few women who are not strong enough to be that. And public policy is at least supposed to be equalizing and also think about equity in some way, and not just equality. Right? So when I speak about the state, and especially at a time when India seems to be doing ease of business and so well in ease of business indices, and that's primarily because we seem to do away with all kinds of labor regulations and restrictions. If the state had any kind of political will to take away from this Me Too movement, would be to bring about, even in terms of numbers, to say this % of women need to be in the workforce. And how do we work around it, not just in terms of committees, but also in terms of directives. Right? So I was telling them earlier that the MHRD has said that at least at the IITs, you need to have 14% women candidates who have to be taken in. Now some might say this is a quota system, and some women might say, but I don't need a quota. But quota is not a bad word, like Vaishnavi had rightly said. Neither is it a black hole where everything is lost. Quota also ensures that in spaces which are heavily crowded, spaces which have come about because of certain kinds of privileges of people from certain backgrounds, how do we make space for the others who have never stepped into these spaces? Right? So IITs have largely been a Brahminical ghetto. IIT Chennai, totally a Brahminical ghetto, from faculty to students. How do you ensure that people from marginalized background, women from marginalized background enter these spaces? You need to have reservations. So similarly, if you need to have women in spaces that you've never seen them before, let's have these come about. Right? That's the first part of it. The other is to look at questions of equity. And this is the more tricky bit, because when we start speaking about equity, immediately it's very easy to say, but itna kuch hai fir bhi nahi aayi. Right? That's the kind of way of thinking about it. There are so many provisions for her and she's still not doing it. When you start focusing on equity, you start asking the larger questions. And the larger questions many times start with the intimate, like you rightly brought about. The roles that we play within families, and family is my pet project because I think it's the most hard institution to break in, because so much of it happens in the name of love. It's not just violence, of course there's a lot of violence, but violence also in the name of love. Right? So when we speak about questions of equity, it starts somewhere there. When we say we don't see enough women in the labor force outside, it's perhaps because there are people not letting women out. And in your families, if you had one role model, you can always cite her, and also she has to marry right, bear in mind. Right? The role model who married right within the same caste, you can keep quoting her and say, see, she studied, so I can also study. So questions of equity have also to be brought in on corporate boards whenever you guys have conversations. And I know it's very difficult to have these conversations with CEO heads who are extremely instrumental. But having said that, I'd briefly like to also talk about academics and the sorry plight that we have. We are like those doctors who don't take our own medicine. So we keep writing nice things about all sectors, and it's heartening to hear the things that the corporates are doing. Yeah? Because we have none of this. 65% of our labor force is informal. We are all contractual employees, and precarity is the only word that comes to my mind every time I think about my existence. Having put in about 10, 15 years of my life into education seriously, I can tell you that I do not know when I would be fired. I could be fired at any point. If I ruffle feathers, if I write something, if I say something, if I'm quoted somewhere, please be careful, I might lose my job. Right? So right now, if you look at our contracts, either you're in Delhi University, you get 4 months contract. You get 4 months because they don't want to pay for your winter and your summer. So after 4 months, you again sit in a fresh pool of people and compete with fresh aspirants in this market. The better off get 1 year, the way it gives us a 1 year contract. Right? Then there is the guest faculty. A guest faculty is somebody who gives a lump sum amount to teach one course in 1 semester. I just met a friend yesterday who says, you are precarious. I aspire to be precarious because I'm just guest faculty. Right? So these are the kind of levels at which our employment is at right now. And it doesn't make it easy for us because this year in March, the government said autonomy to universities, right? And it sounds lovely, the word autonomy, but autonomy is nothing but slow burn privatization. So now the government says 25% of tier 1 universities, which is JNU and all, will have faculty who are foreign faculty. Great, because it's a global slump for all of us in academics. Nobody has jobs, so people abroad would come in. But us here, many of us who are graduating now will not have jobs. Also, the government says that all of these institutions, tier 1, tier 2, slowly have to start raising their own money for any kind of programs that they want to float, which will have no measures of equity or equality. The government is not going to be checking any of those, right? And this is the self-financing model that we have, which means that in years to come, when we want our children to be educated, we are going to be selling a kidney or two, just like people in the US who are in debt traps, to educate our children. This is the state of public education. And there's a stronger push for privatization. What happens to gender in all of it? Forget the maternity leave, right? There's no question about that. There's an army of foot soldiers who are ready to take up the job as soon as you quit. So you're going to see the pyramidal structure which already exists of academics. At the entry point, we're pretty much equal. And like you said, 2080 as you go up, it's about 30-70 for us. Sciences, it's worse. So with all of this, it's just going to get worse. You're going to see lesser number of women at associate and professor levels because the choice inevitably is going to be between having a family or having one leg into this precarious labor market. And this is a choice nobody should be asking.
And just in talking about quotas, or as you know, in more the sort of the global terminology, temporary special measures. They're called special measures because they are trying to kind of overcome historical discrimination in a way. And Europe's done it very successfully, and that without the angst that you talked of, without those kind of angst about actually what would happen to corporates by actually putting in these kind of measures of having 50-50 women in leadership roles. Norway's got that. They were the first people off in terms of putting it in place. All across Europe now you actually have quotas in the private sector, right? And of course there's a huge pushback in India for doing that. But you don't really see any pitfalls. If at all, you actually see benefits of putting in those measures in the private sector in Europe. In India, we always tend to look towards the US, which obviously has really, in terms of gender labor laws, they're really bad. And we always try and follow that model rather than the European model in terms of. And you'll actually also see, if you look at sort of the European companies in India, they tend to do far better in terms of numbers. If you look at the Anglo-Dutch companies or European companies, you'll see that they're actually doing much better in terms of gender diversity because their global policies are so much better. In terms of role modeling, a lot of the conversations are around women. Gender equality means about women, right? How do you bring that discussion to men? And I'd like to start with you. How are you seeing, because unless it's an issue that's seen and perceived by both men and women, possibly that's not going to work. So how are you seeing that?
So when I started with IW, the Women Network, I've been associated with that for a long time because I've had some really great friends there. A lot of people, so I was probably the only guy who would get called for them because I used to believe in that stuff. And people would call me Kanaiya and all those names, right? But the fact is, it's unfortunate, but the fact is, I believe in what I do. It's not easy. Having said that, I think what has changed, especially in the corporate world, at least what I can talk about my organization is, the voice, it's come from the top, right? Diversity is a #1 priority. And I want to quote an example, right? Every interviewer, every candidate that we interview, one question that I ask is about diversity. What's your view on gender diversity? What's your perception about it? And I tell them what is Invesco's philosophy, this is what we do, and I would like to hear your perspective. Now I have very unique views I get from the men and the women. The women come in and just say, I don't like this quota system. I want to be there on meritocracy. That's what you believe in. Take me on the basis of my merit. The guy comes in, they say, sir, robotics is taking away half the work. Now you're telling that 30% is going to be, or whatever, 30 or 40% is going to be now we're going to do in workforce. Where does that put me? So the mindset, you know how it changes. It's so different, and you got to tackle with a lot of these problems. So there is a fundamental problem in the system itself. So having said that, how we're trying to address is that one, the messages come from the top that it's number one of our top priorities, right? I mean, making money is one, but diversity is equally important. And we've put the ownership and accountability on all the leadership across all levels, put that on the goals so that you get measured and there is a metric associated with it. Now, I agree that a lot of people may debate that, what is this 35, 40%? I mean, it sounds very cheesy, but you know what? We have a problem, right? And we need to take some course, we need to do some course correction, get up the curve, fix the problem, then it becomes a part of the culture. So there's a lot of debate going on about, was it the right thing to do? But fundamentally we have a problem, and I think one way that we're trying to tackle that is fixing ownership and accountability across the entire leadership, men, women, and putting a metric in place so that there's ownership and accountability and it gets reported out so that it's not just another checklist in the box.
Vaishnavi, you also alluded to in your first response that there is a lot of perception anyway of women being in the film industry, right? What are some of the things that you're doing or you're seeing for other film directors or others to kind of address some of these issues of bias and stereotype?
Self-sustainability. I only work with women. This film that I completed, it's an all-women crew, and I sometimes find it difficult to find somebody for a very niche skill. If I had all the money in the world, I could bring them down from around the world, right? But I wouldn't, and I have to sort of weigh it against my means. Sometimes I have even delayed the project to a point where I find somebody who is a woman, and I'm only willing to work with her. Now that comes with its own challenges, okay? One, finding them, and two, women are people, and people have problems, right? Just like how two men would have, two women would have, and men and women would have. But that is not to say that, that should be the reason why you shouldn't or should do something. You just find a way to get together and hit this target. If film is what you're trying to do, just grit your teeth and get to the end of the tunnel. Like Ujit just said, for cinema as well, for independent filmmaking, there is nobody to employ us for us to be fired. That's a far more scarier situation. I have to crowdfund for my film. And when you say feminist, activist, people just keep going one step backward. Now you go forward and say you want to make a film about women's rights, they're like, I'm not sure. I don't understand your politics. That's the end of discussion. How then? I believe that audiovisual medium can bring about a great change, a great deal of change. I do believe that because I have seen it happen in front of my eyes. How then somebody who is willing, who has got the skill, who can possibly bring about a change, go about doing it without the capital? There is no boss. We don't have allocated budget to go make this film, and therefore this is the qualitative/quantitative response or effect that it has on the society. But you still do it. I think 3-4 years ago, I think, much before the whole Me Too and everything, is when I started this community called Women Making Films. Women Making Films is basically just a database of female filmmakers from around the world. Right now it has members from over 19 countries, where they just put up their work and say that they exist. First thing, they say that I am from Kenya, I direct, I do cinematography, I edit, I exist. That's like putting your signature on the World Wide Web. That's the first step. And the second step is I try and see how I can work with somebody from Kenya. I figure a way out. We work remotely. This film that I just completed, my editor is German, my music composer is American, my cinematographer is from Chennai, and then there are a bunch of other films, other people who are Indians but are in different parts of the world. I categorically sat down and decided, even if I couldn't find that name in my contact list, I put that name in my contact list somehow and I only work with them. I think that's the only way forward for women. Now, going forward, there are a lot of American companies who have set up these thriving interfaces for women to come together as well. Crowdfunding, for example, there is an amazing company called Seed and Spark in the US. It's run by two co-founders, two women. They have their Series C funding already. They're doing really well. They only help projects that are helmed by women, and they help people crowdfund for the project. What's different about this is they also provide opportunity to distribute it. Now slowly, when more women like Seed and Spark co-founders come about, that distribution model is also a capitalist model. Now the filmmakers make money, the company co-founders make money, people watch something innovative for the money that they're spending. It's like the Netflix model, but only it's for women. I mean, in the long term, I have such vision to do something like that in India as well. I mean, it'll take a while, but I have wild ideas, but it'll take a while. So if slowly women are interested in investing on projects that are helmed by women, I think that's the starting point we're looking at. Because the change will not happen right away, right? But over a course of time, if you had somebody who you don't have to convince, saying the change will happen, which is mostly been the challenge right now. Because you go to some guy who's a producer who has a ton of money to spare, how do you tell that guy that this film will bring about the change? But if there is a woman already who understands it, she just gives you some money and you do the film, you do a good job, it's done. I think, if that makes sense, I think that's the only way I see things going forward.
You seeing some things which are working in terms of changing the unconscious bias or attitudes of men or...
So I definitely see similar biases which Vijay spoke about in terms of, so this is basically the favorite ground where you get the real sense of what's happening in the organization is go to the Sutta Bandi. Yeah, just go for that smoke joint and you will know the pulse of what's happening. Boys Club, right? So, which is where really you get the pulse of how men see the initiatives which are for the woman by the woman, the I win kind of thing, right? So one organization, and they are fairly well known in the IT space, they have this program which is talking about mid-level women when there are a certain number of women at senior manager above. And if they leave, they want to replace those jobs only with women. And they are okay to keep them open. We spoke about that. So at the cost of, retaining that woman, because it's so difficult to get women from outside, they bend backwards and they give promotions, they give work, all what's possible things to make sure that the woman stays. Woman is very happy, but what happens to the other 10 or the 9 men is the sutta conversation which is happening and say she got it easy because she's a woman. So there are very counterintuitive programs. It's a very thin line you need to walk. At what point in time you want to give privilege, at what time you need to pull off, it's not easy, right? So that's said from what Vijay was talking, at a leadership level, if you have that clarity, it's easier to navigate these things into the system. And second part, which you were talking about, is the family part. I am working with women at grassroots levels at tier 3 colleges and tier 3 cities. So what we are doing with them is life skills, and we are saying problem solving skills. And problem solving at 30,000 feet about how do I navigate my life for next 30 years, how do I deal with stakeholders around me, and conversations like that. We are extending those conversations with the parents. So we are going to the Adilabad or Mehboob Nagar or Warangal, where the girls have never visited a place like Hyderabad. They don't even know how to take a bus ticket, right? They don't know how to stay in a hostel. How are you expecting the parents to know any better, right? And it's so difficult for them to send them to workplaces. They say, no, 12th pass kar liya, ab shaadi kar lenge. That's the conversation which happens. So for the mindset to change, she rightly said, it has to change at a family level. So we are empowering, coaching, and doing hand-holding for the parents and saying, let her go, she will figure out her way. That's going to change the supply of women at workplaces. He said 90% of women talent he's seeing. And my data, which is basically jobs which are 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 rupee jobs, women come into Hyderabad and within 2 months they are dropping out because they just don't know how to deal with the whole overwhelming urban city experiences, right? So bringing them into workplaces is one, sustaining is a very different story. And it's much complicated in the bottom of the pyramid. We are talking about engineering and 50,000 rupee jobs. You are educated, it's a little nudging, but here it's a mindset change. So very difficult at that level.
Importance of the informal sector. Okay? And there is an assumption that as soon as we think informal, we think dark, dingy rooms of some corner of the world. But much of the formal is sustained by the informal. So all of our labor force, which is in the informal sector, also needs to be covered by the same kind of measures that we have in the organized sector, like Vaishnavi was talking about. The Unorganized Workers Social Security Act of 2008 does not even recognize women as workers. It sees them as women as mothers and as widows, but there is no provision for sexual harassment. There have been some amendments that have been made to it, but that's the idea. So the first battle when we speak about the informal sector is to recognize the informal as the formal. The second thing is to realize that women in the informal, when they work at home, that's not an extension of a wife or a mother's role. They are workers. Even if the site of work is the home, they are workers. And as soon as you begin thinking of them as workers, you start thinking about their rights. Because no longer is it just the familial, but it's actually a professional job that they're undertaking. Much of production in this country, whether it be the automobile or the shrimp industry, so much of back-end jobs happen at home. This is great cost cutting because you don't need to you don't need to have office spaces, factory floors with electricity, none of that. All that cost is taken care of. So the bottom rung of the pyramid, where bulk of the women work, if we start recognizing them as workers, you start thinking about their rights. So for example, if you think about agricultural workers, women have always worked in agriculture. Suddenly our economic survey, the last 2017-18 says feminization of agriculture. That's ridiculous. You've suddenly woken up to the fact that women are active participants in agriculture because men are migrating away. And you only see women. But women have always been agricultural workers. It's just that they've never been called farmers because they haven't been given the land or the patta. So recognition of the informal sector as formal and women as workers and their rights are the two strong points that needs to come at the policy level here. That move needs to be made.
Just bear with us for a few minutes. We're going to just present a few mementos expressing our gratitude to the panelists and the keynote speaker. And as that happens, a big thank you to Amita for your support, for everyone's contribution to this important dialogue and issue of gender equity in the workplace. A big shout out to Jyoti and her team, Steffi, all of you, for your invaluable support in making this event happen and run so seamlessly. And thanks to all of you, the audience. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules, that too on a weekday. We all know how that is, to come and attend this event. And in conclusion, just drawing on all the discussions that I've heard, I think it is very clear as we leave the room that even as a society, at an individual, organizational, at a systemic level, we all have to collectively address this issue of gender equality, inequality at the workplace. And also, I think awareness is no longer enough. I think that's something which has really come out in all the discussions that we've been having. There's a need to amplify this discourse. There is a need to transform this awareness into action. And we really have to think about taking concrete steps towards that goal. On that note, thank you.